It's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Claudia Hammond, many of you will know, she's an award-winning broadcaster, author, psychology lecturer. In her work, she shares the way that psychological and medical research can help us in our everyday lives. She's on TV, she's on radio, podcasts, public events, books. She's a presenter of several podcasts and radio shows, which I advise you all to check out, especially All in the Mind on Radio 4, and also Health Check on BBC World Service as well. She's a visiting professor of the public understanding of psychology at the University of Sussex and gives talks on psychology around the world, and also writes a column on medical myths for BBC Future. Now, tonight she'll be talking about her latest book, The Art of Rest, examining the science behind our struggles to rest and relax. But don't forget, she's also written several other fantastic books, including Mind Over Money, Emotional Roller Coaster, and my personal favourite, Time Warped, all about our perception of time. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Claudia Hammond. Hi, Claudia.
Hello, hi. Thanks very much for having me. It's lovely to be here. I mean, being here, obviously, but being with you virtually is lovely. And at least we didn't have to go out in the rain tonight, so that's
it's pretty miserable outside in London. Anyway, it's enough of the chit chat. I think it's time to talk about the very serious subject of rest. So your book's called The Art of Rest, but the first thing, I guess, is, what is rest? How would we define rest? Is it the same as sleep, or how do we go about sort of putting a kind of definition of it?
Yeah, I'd say it's not the same as sleep. And often doctors will, or other medical staff will say to people, you must get rest, make sure what you do is rest so that they can recover, without necessarily it being clear what that actually means. So what I'm talking about is the kind of rest we do when we are awake, but the rest that is, it's temporary, it's voluntary, it's restorative, you feel better afterwards. It's something that gives you permission not to achieve anything particular at that moment. It's relaxing. But it can, as we will hear, it can be all sorts of different things. I mean, the official Oxford English Dictionary definition of rest is respite from labour or exertion of any kind, or freedom from absence of labour, exertion or activity of any kind, leisure, idleness, inactivity. And I think it's really interesting there that some of those definitions put it in opposition to activity, that in a way we can't look at rest on its own without thinking about busyness. It's almost hard to define without it being the opposite of what's going on. And what I want people to do is to value rest more. And so that's why I've been interested in looking at the evidence from research and what it can tell us about the rhythms of rest and activity, because we definitely do need to have both of those.
And so I believe we were going to start asking people as a good way of kicking off. So if you'd like to click on the polls button, anyone that's watching, we're going to ask, do you get enough rest? I don't know if you'd like to comment on the results as they come in, Claudia.
Yes, I will. So we just got the options yes or no for do you get enough rest. I noticed at the moment there. I love the way they move about. It's quite exciting when it's live, isn't it? When I did this, funnily enough, this morning, I was talking to A-level students about rest. And I also did a poll about do you get enough rest with them. And there, 87% said that they didn't get enough rest. And that what they wanted was some more rest. So this is quite encouraging that almost a third of people are getting enough rest, which is nice. And what is fascinating about this is at this moment, it's changing now, it's changing. We're getting, we're sort of on 2/3 of no's. But what is really fascinating about those figures is that currently they mirror exactly what we found in a piece of research called the rest test, which I know we'll discuss later on, where there 2/3 of people said they didn't get enough rest and a third of people thought that they did get enough rest. So I think that's really interesting how exactly these are mirroring it, whereas the A-level students were even busier, they felt, or not able to get enough rest, which I think is interesting. Yes, I think we've settled there on about 2/3, 1/3, yes and no, which is exactly what I'd expect to see. I love it when you find what you expect to see.
You should have written that on a piece of paper and showed it.
That's right. I should have done to show. Yes, I've written it in the sealed envelope. But I think that, a lot of us feel that modern life means we don't get enough chance to rest and that we might feel overwhelmed with our to-do list. We know that half of sick days from work are taken due to work-related stress. And I think in one way we feel very busy, but if you look at time use studies going back, say, if you look in the 1950s, it's not the case that people had loads more spare time then than they have now, but it doesn't feel like that to us. And I think part of that is that the boundaries between work and leisure have become less clear than they were, and obviously new technology is part of that. You can be contacted at any time, and of course now that so many people are working from home, those boundaries between work and leisure are even less, because all the research that's been done so far shows that people are working longer hours at home than they used to when they went into work. Even though they're gaining the commute time, they're not gaining extra free time, and they're actually working longer, partly because when exactly should you stop if you're working from home? And I think as well, we have people do these days seem to have quite high standards for themselves. So people might want to be better, try and be better people, to improve themselves, say to learn mindfulness or the piano, or to get fit, or to look a certain way, or to cook amazing meals if people come around in the days when people were allowed to come around for meals. And all of those things are adding to how busy people feel and the amount that they have to do. And I think also busyness has almost become something of a badge of honour, as Professor Gershuni, who works at Oxford on time use, has put it. And the writer, Henry David Thoreau, said, "It's not enough to be busy, so are the ants. What are we busy about?" So I think we need to think about how much our busyness achieves and whether all of it is necessary or not. And also, if people say, how are you? And so they might say to me, how are you? And I'll say, oh, I'm fine, quite busy, a bit too busy, really. In a way, that feels true, but in a way, it's also a claim to status, a claim to saying, look how in demand I am, look how important I am. I must be really busy. And the problem is that we do think that busy people are better, and this wasn't always the case. So if you look, say, on Instagram now at celebrities, rich celebrities and their feeds, a lot of the time they'll be showing how busy they are. They'll be showing all the things they're going to, not now obviously, but usually all the things they're going to and all the things they're doing. They might have a picture of them holiday on a beach, but mostly they'll be doing things and showing how busy they are. If you think of 18th century gentlemen of leisure, and they were usually rich gentlemen, then they would show off their status by being busy in their city club and then going off to the countryside to have more and more leisure time, not busy with work things. And so I think it's changed how that status is. And there is evidence showing that busyness does give us a certain status, and that unfortunately we believe that busy people are better. So there's a study I like done by a psychologist in America called Sylvia Bellessa, and what they do is they give people some made-up Facebook status updates of a fictional character called Sally Fisher. And there are two versions of Sally Fisher. And some people are given a version of Sally Fisher where she says things like, on a Wednesday at 1 o'clock, she says, I've got a nice hour-long lunch break now. And at 5 p.m. on a Friday, she says, I'm done with work, that's it. And then she's the less busy version of Sally Fisher. And then there's a busy version of her. And at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday lunchtime, she'll say, no time to stop. I'm going to quick grab a sandwich and get back to work in 10 minutes. And on Friday at 5, she says, I've still got loads to do. I'm going to be here for hours. So that's the busier version of Sally Fisher. And then they ask people what they think of her. Now, interestingly, people don't say that her Facebook status updates are a little bit dull and that perhaps they should be more interesting and perhaps it wasn't worth saying them. No, instead, what they say is that the busy Sally Fisher is better organized, probably better at multitasking, and has a more interesting and meaningful job. And people have read all of that into the fact that the other poor Sally Fisher was allowed an hour for lunch. And I think that the problem is that breaks have become much rarer. It virtually has to be your birthday to have an hour off for lunch these days. You have to kind of explain yourself. And particularly, we know that when people are working from home, they don't really take breaks. Only 1% of senior schools now have breaks in the afternoon, and far more used to do that. So it does seem as though there is a sense in which we feel we can't rest and we feel we can't stop, and that it's not okay to.
That's interesting. So if I can just back up slightly, obviously we've talked about what rest is, and we've sort of discussed examples of people's different feelings around it. But I guess this might sound like a stupid question, but there's lots of things that we take for granted as being sort of, in title case, good for us, like brown bread or reading books or getting exercise, and these sort of things are taken as read as being good things. We have to be sleeping 8 hours a day or whatever, all these kind of things. So is rest good for us? Is it actually stopping and doing nothing for, just twiddling my thumbs, or, doing playing a video game or doing some nonsense thing? Is that actually good for me, or should I actually be better off learning the violin in those periods of time or something useful?
It depends. So what we need is this balance between activity and rest. So we do know that when people are resting, their blood pressure reduces, their heart rate reduces. We also know it is good for us mentally, and good for us cognitively, that it can boost memory and concentration when people have a rest. And we know that the opposite, fatigue, leads to lapses in memory and blunted emotions and poor concentration or misunderstandings, poor judgments, even accidents, say, if people are driving and they're too weary. And there've been some really interesting studies on this. There's one I like by Michaela Dewar in Scotland. And this is about how breaks can improve your memory. And she does very straightforward memory tasks where people are asked to, say, learn lists of words. And then half the group go and sit in a darkened room for 10 minutes. The other half of the group are given some other tasks to do. Not difficult tasks, but they don't get a break. They have to carry on going. And then she looks to see afterwards how many of this great long list of words can people recall. And the people who had the 10-minute break can remember significantly more words from that time. And she's also done this really interestingly with people with amnesia. Now, most people with amnesia can't make new memories, so it's very hard for them to learn, say, a list of words. And usually people with amnesia can get 14% of the words on this kind of task. But if they have a 10-minute break before trying to recall the words, that leapt up, Michaela Dewar found, to 49%, which is really staggering for an intervention when people have amnesia. Now, obviously, that's just at that moment, and learning word lists isn't a really useful thing. But I think it does show us how breaks can be so useful cognitively. And they don't even have to be a really long time. So there's a study that I really like from South Korea on micro breaks. So micro breaks, I mean, they vary in different studies, might be 40 seconds long or 2 minutes long. This particular study, they were 2 minutes long. And in these 2-minute micro breaks, when people were working in offices, they either went to stare out of the window for 2 minutes, or lean their head back in their chair and shut their eyes for 2 minutes, or go and get a drink of something, but bring it straight back to their desk. So they just had 2 minutes, not necessarily even away from their screens, but they might have their eyes shut or be doing something else. And they got them to take these throughout the day. And also they were measuring their attention throughout the day and their well-being at the end of the day. And after they'd had a micro break, their attention was still better an hour later than after that break, even though it was only 2 minutes long. And at the end of the day, if they'd had several of these micro breaks all day long, in addition to a proper break at lunchtime, then their well-being levels were higher at the end of the day. And I think the difficulty is that what we do know from the research is that breaks are most valuable when the demands on us are highest. And of course, that's the time when you're less likely to do it. So if people are up against a deadline, they often reward themselves off by thinking, well, when I've finished this piece of work, then I'll go and make a cup of tea. I'll reward myself. I'll just get this done and then I'll do that. And there's a really interesting study from Germany on this. And they found that it was a mistake to do this, because if people rewarded themselves before they'd finished, if they went and had their break while they were still going, they were able to be more productive afterwards because their concentration was better. And we know that, high productivity is caused by, attention and creativity, not by just hard slog necessarily. That what you need to do is to have those breaks and break off. Now, obviously not for a really long time. And the trouble is, when you are up against a deadline, that is really, really hard, because it is so tempting to just carry on. And now, having seen that research, I very deliberately say to myself, I know this has got to be done, but I am going to go and make a cup of tea and come back and get back into it again, because you can get it done that way. So this is not a charter for laziness, I'm afraid. This is about getting the balance of rest and activity right.
So Claudia, I might have just missed this in your when you were talking about micro breaks, but what would be the frequency of those micro? Every sort of hour, every half hour?
Yes. So, I mean, you could, I think, they varied it in the study, they varied it, but yes, it would be a really good idea to do that every half hour. And obviously we know that screen breaks are a good idea, and, rest your eyes, anyway. So I think in a way, what you need to do is to, do basically all the things that you're told not to do at school. are really good for you, like staring out of the window and daydreaming and doodling, as long as you do them, obviously not all day and all the time, because you can't get anything done. But I think if you want to sit in your office, when we're back in offices, and shut your eyes, you can say to your boss, this is evidence-based. So there is good evidence that this is good for me, and is allowed. And I think that, again, is one of the problems with working from home. I know some people love working from home and are liking it better. And the well-being of people who hated their jobs and hated their workplaces has gone up while people are working at home, while there are, all sorts of technological difficulties to surmount, and the difficulties of not, socializing in the same way. But I think one of the real problems is the natural breaks aren't there that happen in many workplaces, where somebody just chats about something, or you hear something interesting going on. And if you work somewhere where you are allowed to get up and chat about that, some places are obviously very strict and you can't. But if you do work somewhere where you can, those breaks just happen naturally. And that's what you don't get at home in the same way.
I mean, just thinking about this. So when I was at university, my chemistry lecturer, who later turned out to be Peter Wuthers, who gave the Christmas lectures, in fortunate circumstances, I got to work with him again sort of 10 years later. But anyway, he would take a break halfway through. We'd have this being a ridiculous university, we had lectures on Saturday mornings. So halfway through his 9 a.m. Saturday morning lecture, he would say, look, you've all stopped paying attention and we're going to take a 2-minute break. And he'd tell us a little story from the history of chemistry or something. So basically what I'm getting to is, should I, at about 7:45 in this talk, should we all just stare out the window would that be good?
In one way, it's not a bad idea, or to get up and be able to just stretch. And I think it's interesting, actually, and particularly online, because we know that, people will now have all have heard of Zoom fatigue, and how it is more tiring trying to attend to what people are saying when you can't see all of their body language and all of the things that are going on, all the cues you would use if you were in the same room, and that you've got to concentrate. People can't talk over each other in the same way. That can be useful, and it's tiring. And so I think, actually, particularly maybe now with online events, that people should be having breaks. And I've noticed, actually, in some things, I quite often chair long whole day events and conferences. And one thing I've noticed with them being online is that organizers will often say, well, we're not going to have any breaks, because if we have breaks, people will go away and they won't come back. And I try and persuade them. I think it's the other way around. One, you need to be able to concentrate, but also people do need to, check their emails, or, go to the loo, or make a cup of tea, or do those things. And so actually, I don't think they'll necessarily go away. So I'm constantly campaigning for people to include breaks in their timetables.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And also, I think if you've got a finish line, if you're like, oh, well, this session's over in half an hour, I can get up, make a cup of tea and come back, then rather than thinking, oh, it's going to be another 5 hours before I can actually leave my desk. I think that's,
I think otherwise people are more likely to just leave and just think, oh, I can't be doing with this. This is too much like hard work, yeah.
Anyway, I think you mentioned something earlier. I think I'd like to delve into a bit more, Claudia. So you mentioned something called the rest test. So this was, I think, a bigger survey of people's different attitudes to rest and what they found relaxed. So if you'd like to just explain a little bit more about that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So the rest test all goes back to part of a residency that I was part of on the 5th floor of the Wellcome Collection in London a couple of years ago now. And basically a group of 5 of us got together. Someone else that wasn't me had the brilliant idea of us looking at rest. And we applied for this grant. It was actually a £1 million grant. Can I stress that we don't get the £1 million for ourselves? And we applied for this, and to our amazement, got it. And then we were able to employ all sorts of people of doing different things, to look from all sorts of disciplines. It was interdisciplinary, to look at the topic of rest over the next 2 years. And it was amazing. We had artists and composers, and geographers, social scientists, historians, neuroscientists, all sorts of different people, all working together on this one subject. And I always thought it really reminded me a bit of being a student again. And sitting around talking to people from all the different disciplines, except that all these people have been chosen because they all knew so much about their subjects now. And it was absolutely fascinating seeing, I'm all in favour of sort of arts and science projects working together, just seeing the different perspectives that people come from very different disciplines was so interesting, because so much of the work I do, I'm very, very used to interviewing psychologists and doctors and researchers and scientists, who are all great, and I do love that. But it was absolutely fascinating seeing how the different artists worked, and we did all sorts of different things during that time. We had lots of exhibitions and public events. There was a a new composition that the composer created, which was premiered on Radio 3. It was an absolutely amazing experience, the whole thing. And Welcome gave us enormous freedom to do what we wanted. And one of the things that I was really interested in doing was knowing what lots of people thought. And so there were lots of psychologists from Durham University who were part of it, and Felicity Callard, who's amazing, was running the whole thing. And so what we did was to create, the psychologists created the rest test, which was an online survey. And then it was launched I launched it on All in the Mind on Radio 4 and on Health Check, my World Service program. And that meant that we had the opportunity for it to get out to a really huge audience. So across a week, more than 70 million people listen to the World Service in English across a week. No, sorry, 97 now. It keeps going up. It's 97 million is the latest figure. Forgive me. And that's just in English, obviously more in other languages. And so this gave us an opportunity to reach a lot of people. And then we waited to see whether people would take part or not. Now, obviously, the big downside of this kind of research methodologically is that it is a self-selecting sample. So is it the case we're only going to get people who desperately want to rest more, or who love spending all their time resting, taking part? Now, we hoped that wasn't the case because it took maybe nearly 40 minutes to fill in. So we're hoping that the laziest people of all, who were just resting all the time, selected themselves out and wouldn't want to stay for the whole 40 minutes and take part. So that's what we hope. Now, obviously, so that's the disadvantage of this kind of study, because people are self-selecting. You can't get a representative sample. But we were able to look at things like age and income and all sorts of factors that we were looking at to see how representative it was. And people took part from 135 countries, which was absolutely fascinating. So in terms of sample size, this did end up being the largest study that's been done on rest to date. And one of the things we asked people was how much rest they had had the previous day. The average was 3 hours. We asked people whether they thought they got more rest than average, or whether they felt in need of more rest, a bit like we asked earlier. And we found that the people who think that they get more rest than average and who don't need more rest had well-being scores twice as high on average than the people who felt that they needed more rest, which was really interesting. And obviously these are averages, so that, for individuals you could find different things. And we looked to see, in terms of well-being, what seemed to be the optimum amount of rest for people. And it seemed to be about 5 or 6 hours. If they'd had 5 to 6 hours of rest the previous day, their well-being scores were higher. If they'd had, say, 1 or 2 hours rest the previous day, their well-being scores were lower. But they were also lower if they'd had more than that. So if they'd had, say, 10 or 11 hours of rest the previous day, their well-being scores were lower. And this might reflect that perhaps the people who'd had that much rest were perhaps unemployed and didn't want to be, or perhaps ill and were forced to rest. And so enforced rest doesn't seem to be restful. It is all about the rhythms of rest and activity. I'm not saying that if we just all rested all the time, well, the life would be great. It wouldn't be. It does matter what it's in opposition to. And I think that's interesting in terms of what some people found during the pandemic, particularly during, here I am talking as if it's over, not obviously, but during the first lockdown, when obviously there were suddenly huge differences between how much rest people got, because some people were busier than ever, maybe working in hospitals, working in all sorts of essential services, keeping supermarkets going, etc. Some people were working from home and struggling with that and trying to homeschool kids at the same time. They were suddenly really, really busy. Others had been furloughed and now couldn't go out anymore and see friends and do other stuff. So there was this mixture of people, some with more time to rest and some with less. And a lot of people who didn't have work were telling me that it didn't feel restful in the way that they had expected it might, which fits in with say when people are in prison, they may have 23 hours a day resting, if you like, on their bed in their cell if they're unlucky. And people will not find that restful. They find that the time drags and that they feel tired and exhausted, and it's not restful. So enforced rest isn't the same. It needs to be chosen. And we allow people to define rest for themselves, because people find different sorts of things restful. On average, men said that they thought that they got less rest than average. In fact, they got 10 minutes more rest on average a day than women, but but only 10 minutes. And then a really key thing that we asked people was which activities they considered to be the most restful. And this was absolutely fascinating. And this is what I've based the book around, is the top 10. I count down backwards, Sunday, now Friday, chart style, from 10 down to 1 of what activities people found the most restful. And what is really interesting for me is some of the things that aren't in there. So eating, for example, was at number 21. Pets was at number 14. Gardening, which is very, very popular, was at number 13. Socializing was at number 20. Even if we took, because we looked at personality as well, even if we took the people who were the most extroverted, who scored highest on extroversion scales, still socializing and chatting, seeing friends and family didn't come in the top 10, which is interesting, of course, because that's something people are so yearning to do at the moment. But of course, we weren't asking people what their most enjoyable activities were. We were asking them what they found restful. And the top 5 activities were all things which people tend to do on their own. And so one of the things that we've concluded from that is that in order to rest and feel rested, people possibly need a break from other people, and that even if they're people you really like and really love, you still have to, they're still tiring in one sense, because you've got to consider them when they're there, and you've got to think about what they want and what they don't. And I thought it was striking that watching TV, which we counted as anything that could be streaming films, watching Netflix, whatever, that came at number 9. And I think one of the things we know about when people are watching TV is a fifth of the time they're talking while they're watching TV to each other, but you don't have to. You're allowed to sit there in parallel, enjoying the same experience together. And there is no requirement to try and speak, to have to speak like there is when you're socializing. And so I think it's really striking that what people seem to want is some time on their own.
That's a really interesting, especially, during lockdown when you're maybe stuck in your flat with your significant other / family.
Yes, yes, exactly.
That's really interesting as well. Because obviously I can imagine, depending on what you're watching on TV, that could totally, if I'm watching an incredibly tense football match that I care deeply about, I'm not going to find that restful in any way. But if I'm just watching some slow TV of a Norwegian train journey, that's going to be much better, surely.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because what I've been trying to do is to get to by looking at all these activities and details, get to the essence of what counts, why is something restful when something else isn't. And I think it can be something exciting, like the football match or whatever, or the thriller. It can be that, because that is distracting you. And I think distraction from what you're doing and the thoughts in your head that are going round and round, distraction from your worries, I think is one of the really key things about rest. And so we found, for example, that 8% of people said they found running restful. 38% of people said they found walking restful. So, and both of those things obviously involve some exertion. So it's not the case that you have to be doing nothing in order to feel rested, and that some people find that they can't really rest their minds and rest these thoughts going round, the rumination, particularly when it's negative thoughts, that they can't really rest their mind until they've exerted their bodies. And so I think sometimes the exciting thing, weirdly, can be the thing that's restorative and relaxing and restful. It hasn't got to be sort of lying down with whale music. Although, if you like that, that's fine.
I was going to say that sort of tracks with my experience as a not particularly good runner, that my brain really only has space for thoughts of, I can't really breathe and my legs really hurt. Exactly. So I can't really think of anything else like what I'm stressing about work or anything. So I think that's definitely true. I was going to move on to a couple of examples of things that you found in the rest test as being sort of in your top 10 countdown. And one that I was really interested in was number 8, which was daydreaming, which seems like a sort of very odd activity to be the subject of scientific study. But there has definitely been some really interesting research on it, hasn't there?
Oh, there's been loads, actually. It's often called mind wandering in the literature, and there has been lots on that. And it's become a real topic of interest for neuroscientists in particular. And it was always assumed until the early 90s, it was assumed that when the brain wasn't concentrating on a task like doing arithmetic or memorizing word lists or tasks like that, solving a problem, that when the brain wasn't doing that, that it would just rest, and that it would use less energy at that time, and there'd be less activity going on. And then in 1995, a neuroscientist called Barrett Biswell published a really groundbreaking paper where when people are in a brain scanner, there's a sort of standard procedure where you can see a screen in front of you in order to do the tasks that you've asked to do. And this is if people are in an fMRI scanner that's trying to measure the activity in the brain, in different parts of the brain, when people are doing particular tasks or things. So if, say, you're trying to investigate where in the brain do people do mathematical calculations, then you get them to do some maths. And then before you go on to the next task, which might be something different, you get them to stare at a cross, like a black background with a white cross, or a white background with a black cross. And you get them to just stare at that cross for several minutes. And the idea always has been that this resets the brain to neutral. It just sort of makes it ready, if you like, to start the next task and to see what areas are activated by that. And what Barrett Biswell discovered was that between the tasks, while people did nothing and just stared at this cross, there wasn't less activity, there was more activity, and that it wasn't random, it was coordinated, and always seemed to happen when this took place. And this was followed up by another neuroscientist, Gordon Schulman, using a PET scanner, a different kind of scanner. And he was hoping to find out what happened in the brain when we really pay attention to something. And he found the opposite. He found that when people paid attention to a task, there was a dip in overall activity. But when they had nothing to do, it was almost as if the brain was set free and it went wild. And when he sent this paper to the journal, the referees actually, when they were peer reviewing it, thought there was a mistake. They thought that he must have got the data the wrong way around, and it should be really active when you're doing the task and really restful in between. So it seems that the brain isn't he really resting when we do nothing? And this is known as the resting state. And there's now been hundreds and hundreds of studies on the resting state. The network of activity that happens is known as the default mode network. And this is the network that the brain defaults to, if you like, when it hasn't got to be doing something else. And what people are doing is daydreaming, is their mind wanders. And Marcus Raichler, who's one of the leaders in this field, wonders whether this activity could account for why the brain appears to use 20% of the body's energy when it only needs to have about 5% of the body's energy. So it sort of is greedy. It has too much. And he calls it the brain's dark energy, the dark energy that mystifies physicists. He's saying there's something that's there in the brain that we can't account for what's going on. Is it what's happening during the resting state? A lot. But if the daydreams are daydreams that you enjoy and that are okay, then there is good evidence that it can help us to be more creative, to solve problems, and maybe even to scenarios, almost rehearsing the future, and possibly even rehearsing what we might do if bad things happen in the future. And that maybe we almost create, he says, and this is Moshe Bar at Harvard, he thinks that maybe what we're doing is almost creating memories for things that might happen in the future that we can then draw on if that thing happens. So, I can't be the only person who, when they do when you're on a plane and they do go through the emergency procedures at the beginning, that you imagine, well, what would happen if the slide went down, and how would I do that, and how would I get there? What would that actually be like? And once I'm floating in the sea, is anyone really going to hear that whistle or see that light in the middle of the ocean? I'm sure it's not just me who thinks about that and who works out how you do it and what you do if the front of the plane fell off, and would you hold on? And so maybe if that happened, then you could maybe think, oh, well, this is what I might do. And so maybe we're creating these memories of possible events that might happen in the future. But while I was there, we did while I was part of what was called Hubbub at the Welcome, when we were looking at rest. We had the chance, a really interesting researcher from the University of Nevada came over, called Russell Herbert, and he does something called descriptive experience sampling. And this is a really unusual way of trying to access people's mind wanderings, because of course the real difficulty is you can look and see where activity is happening in the brain, but how do you get people to subjectively tell you, when it's so subjective, tell you about their mind wanderings, and to do it accurately? Because the moment you get somebody to stop and write down their mind wanderings, that's sort of interrupted what they're doing, and then they're not mind wandering anymore. And in this method that he's developed called descriptive experience sampling, you wear a beeper a sort of like a pager around on your waist, and at random 6 times a day it does, and you have an earpiece, and at random 6 times a day it does these piercing beeps, and then you're supposed to immediately write down notes on what you were thinking about the second before the beep. And I had to go at this over 5 days, and so it's 6 times, so it's a day, so it's 30 times, and it was absolutely fascinating. And at the beginning, the first day, I was mainly thinking about, every time the beep went, I was mainly thinking, when's the beep going to go? And the beep hasn't gone yet. Is it working? Has it gone wrong? And then you gradually get a bit more used to it. What was slightly disappointing was that I thought that I'm often thinking about things to do with work and what I'm doing, and thinking deep thoughts, obviously. Not once in those 30 times was I ever thinking about anything deep, which was a shame, or even thinking about work. I was instead thinking about things like, one of them, I remember I was on a train, and I've got a sort of running rucksack, and it's got little hexagonal patterns on it. And at that moment, I happened to be thinking, I wonder why they did hexagons, and did they sit round at a meeting and think, oh, I know, we'll do hexagons, the kind of thing I think. So, and then what Russ Hilbert does is to interview you at length, like about 10 minutes, of questioning about each thought. And at first, when you do it, because my thoughts were so banal, you find yourself slightly trying to make them a little bit more interesting. Like, I stick to the story, but just embellish it a little bit. And he's so used to this that he discounts the first 2 days of any interviews about it, because he knows that everyone does this and tries to make it more interesting. But then he asks you loads of questions about, could you hear the thought in your head, or could you see it, or could you see any words, or were you imagining people, and where were they, were they sort of up here or down there? And it's really interesting how everyone, and I thought, well, this is so subjective. How can he be getting anything from this? And yet, if you talk to someone else who's done it, their thoughts do come out slightly differently, and that some people see them much more in pictures and some people don't. So it's an interesting way of trying to study something that's really, really difficult to study, I think.
Just to quickly say, a couple of people in the chat have said that they've been disconnected. So sorry, I hope everyone's managed to get back on. Don't worry if you've said something in the chat and you've lost it. I've been saving all your questions, and there's been some fantastic questions already, which I'm already looking forward to putting to you, Claudia. But I think we'll move on in a second. One thing I was going to say was, your description of daydreaming, though, does seemingly map quite a lot with the description of dreaming, right? That people say that dreaming is about, going over things that have happened in the day and rehearsing things and sort of like that. So is there any research on, is it more of a continuum between daydreaming, being a bit asleep, being completely asleep, or is there a distinction between rest and dreaming in that sense?
I mean, there's definitely a distinction, and obviously you can. I know some people will try and practice directing their dreams, but you can very consciously direct your daydreams and decide what else to think. I think where the similarities are possibly in why it might be useful in terms of consolidating memories and rehearsing memories. So I think they're very different states, but the similarities are in what they might be useful for.
Fascinating. So I think it's probably now time to move on to number 5, the 5th most restful thing, and according to the rest test, which was seemingly similar to daydreaming but subtly different, which is doing nothing. Yeah, so
and we sort of call this doing nothing in particular in this study. So it could be a bit of posturing around, doing nothing. Now, this is really interesting because people did put down doing nothing, but some people really hate doing nothing and find it very difficult. And we found that 11% of people said that they felt guilty whenever they rested because they weren't achieving. And I think, and talking to audiences, so many people have told me that they feel guilty when they rest and that they don't rest because they feel too guilty. And I think that's why some of the activities involve doing something, particularly something that needs to be done, like say one of them is having a hot bath, because you've got to get clean, haven't you? So that's a sort of excuse for doing that. And I think giving ourselves permission not to achieve something is quite difficult. And so there was, particularly say during the first lockdown, a real sense that people wanted to do lockdown well. And if you hadn't learned 3 languages and the piano and baked perfect sourdough, then you really hadn't succeeded. Whereas just getting through this time, personally, I think is enough. That is a success in itself. So doing nothing, I think, is interesting. The French philosopher Pascal famously said all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And it does seem that some people can just, and this doesn't mean falling asleep, of course, this isn't having a nap, but some people can just sit and stare into space and maybe daydream, or lie on the sofa. Other people find it difficult to do. And so hard that there's one experiment, people might have heard of this, it got quite a lot of publicity at the time, although interestingly, this was only one of the 9 conditions that they were looking at. But there was an experiment done by Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia, where people were given a practice at having an electric shock. And they had a sort of bracelet around their ankle, and they could press the button and give themselves a not harmful but painful electric shock. And then they asked people, would they pay $5 not to have another electric shock? And only the people who said yes, they would pay not to have another electric shock, went into the next bit of the study. And in the next bit of the study, they had to sit in a room for 15 minutes where there was a table and a chair, but no phone, no newspaper, no book, nothing to write with, nothing to do at all. They weren't allowed to fall asleep. They just had to sit there for 15 minutes. But they could, if they wanted to, give themselves another or more than one, if they wanted to, of these electric shocks. And I think we'll do a poll on this one again. So if you had to sit in a room doing nothing for 15 minutes, do you think you would give yourself at least one electric shock? Bear in mind, you have already tried it out, so you do know what it's like. So it's not just about curiosity. Let's see what people say. Oh, we've got some yeses already. Oh, we've got quite a lot of no's. Let's see what's happening there. Oh, we've got lots of no's.
Yeah,
so far more no's.
Yeah, we're looking at about 15% yes to 85% no.
Yeah. Now
I think I'd be in the yes. I'd bore very easily.
Why? Oh, because you're bored. I see.
Because my mind would wander after 10 minutes, and I think I'd be like, go on then.
You think, oh, there's something to do. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the only thing you can see, and you're aware it's there in your ankle, and you've got the button. So I think that's interesting. So we've ended up with 86% saying no and 13% saying yes. Now, what they found, in fact, and of course we don't know who's men and who's women here, because what they found was a really strong sex difference. So 71% of men and 25% of women gave themselves at least one electric shock. And it would have been interesting to know what they would have said beforehand if they'd been asked like this, whether they thought that they would. And one man gave himself 190 electric shocks, which honestly is not bad going in 15 minutes, because you'd have to go quite fast to do that. But masochists apart, he obviously liked it. But the people who don't like it, I think it does show how difficult it is to sit in a room doing nothing at all, and that usually when we think we're doing nothing, actually what we're really doing is pottering, and that in some ways it's quite admirable, the people who can sit and really do nothing, and that doesn't count, say, doing something like mindfulness or meditation. That came at number 10 actually, because that is doing something, and so it's intriguing that so many people said that they can do that, but not nearly as many people as doing some of the other things.
Fascinating. So I'm going to crack on with some of the other things that were rated in the rest test. We had somebody in the chat was a bit concerned that we weren't going to say the top 5. So doing nothing was number 5. So could you just briefly say what 4 and 3 were before I ask you to explain?
Yes.
2?
So number 4 was listening to music. Number 3 was being alone, which was interesting because the top 5 are all things that people tend to do alone. I mean, you could do nothing with somebody else, but you're more likely to do it alone. You could listen to music with somebody else. People often do it alone, though. So yes, number 3 was being alone. And
number 2, which is the one I'm going to ask you to expand on a bit more, might surprise some people that this came so highly, but it was spending time in nature, which I haven't been able to do very much unless you count going to the park occasionally with the dog.
Yes, and actually in Canada and India, spending time in nature came top. Which was quite interesting. Most countries had absolutely the same things top. Germany had being alone top was the other difference, but most people had the same, almost exactly the same top 5 as the UK. So spending time in nature was picked by slightly more women than men, just slightly. And I think that's an interesting one because intuitively, a lot of people will say being in nature is relaxing and being in nature is restful, and it's been surprisingly hard to prove in some ways in research. And there a lot of the studies that have been done on being in nature don't really have an adequate control condition, or they're very, very small samples. But there have been some good studies. There are some studies which get quoted often, but which have a few interesting things going on with them, which might mean they don't mean quite what we think. So There's a famous study done in 1984 by Roger Ulrich called View from a Window. And this was done in a hospital. People had just had gallbladder surgery. And some people had a view from a window of trees and nice things. Other people had a view of a brick wall. And he looked to see when people left hospital and how many painkillers they took. And he found that the people who had the views of the trees took fewer painkillers, significantly fewer, and they left hospital an average of 1 day earlier. So that sounds brilliant. There's just one problem. They weren't randomized to be in one or other of these conditions. And so it's, and the view over the brick wall was nearer to the nurse's station, and the view over the trees was further from the nurse's station. So it is possible that the illest patients get put near the nurse's station, and that the slightly less ill patients get put further away, and they got the nice view. And so maybe they were less ill in the first place, which is why they left hospital earlier and took fewer painkillers. But Roger Ulrich is forgiven because he did a much better study. In the 1990s, he did a randomized study of this where patients, this time he just used photos, big photos on the wall, and patients were randomized to either have a photo of a stream or a nice stream in a forest, or to just have a picture of a brick wall. And the ones who had the stream or the forest took fewer painkillers again and were less anxious, which was nice. More recently, there's been a study done showing again that just pictures can make a difference. This is by Kate Lee in Australia. And 40-second micro breaks in an office, people either looked on their screen at a picture of a rooftop with just like a rooftop on a skyscraper with tarmac, grey tarmac on it, or they had a rooftop with a meadow on it, but it was exactly the same and everything around it was the same, but they'd superimposed a meadow on top of it. And they had to break off from their work and look at this for 40 minutes. And this did seem to make a difference to people's well-being and their attention if they looked at the meadow rather than at the boring, very boring grey roof. And so there have been now some better studies where they get people, for example, Stanford's done one where people either went on a long walk and they checked with GPS that they've been where they said they were. They went for about an hour and a half's walk, either around the lovely landscaping and the woods and so on that are around Stanford, or along the sort of 6-lane highway. I mean, it's still quite a nice 6-lane highway. It's got pictures of, it's got lovely agapanthus all growing, and it's Californian and hot, so it's not nearly as bad as that sounds. But they did find significant differences, and they also used brain scanners, and they found there was less rumination in those who'd been on the countryside walk than the other one. And I think some of the explanations for why people find nature relaxing, and I think that they do, many people, not everyone, but many people, are sometimes leave a bit to be desired. So sometimes there are evolutionary explanations given, and people will say, oh, well, no wonder people like being out in nature because humans evolved mainly on the savannah, and so that must have been lovely and relaxing, so no wonder they like being out in nature. But of course, many humans in the last 40,000 years have evolved above the tree line or in deserts or on tropical islands. It's not all in the same place. Also, I don't believe the savannah was always restful, because obviously there were these things called lions and other things that would kill you. So I think it's a bit different from going for a lovely country walk now, going for a walk if you lived on the savannah and there was prey around. And some will say that humans have that this is all proved by humans having a preference for trees which are thin and then wider at the top, those kinds of trees that you see in the savannah. But in fact, they don't. In fact, when you look at cross-cultural studies, the sorts of trees people like are hugely influenced by where they grew up. So in the UK, many, many more people will say that they like oak trees. In Switzerland, many, many more people will say that they like pine trees and other fir trees. And so where you grew up makes a massive difference to the kinds of landscapes you like. And there's Finnish research showing that the most restorative places tend to be associated with childhood memories or places where you used to live. And that it's the meaning that matters that people give to these things. But I think there are some elements that are more convincing. For example, that nature has landscape views, if you like, have a sort of soft fascination about them, that there's lots of repeated the fractal qualities of nature mean there are lots of repeated shapes, and that might be, we can take a whole view in at once. It's fascinating, particularly if there's water and something slightly moving, without being really, really complex. So a city view might be lovely. I love standing on London's Bridge looking at the views, but more complex because there's more to take in, and that maybe this lets us relax somehow. But I think it's more to do with the perspective that nature gives us, and that the perspective that time moves on. You see dead tree stumps and you see the kind of cycle of life going on. But also I think it can put your own worries into perspective, that even in your local park, there are beetles living their lives that don't give a monkey's about the things that you're worrying about at this moment, and that things are carrying on and going on. And I've been really struck over the years. I've interviewed quite a few astronauts, and they're always interesting astronauts, I think. And they all say the same thing, which is that when they went up, say, to the space station and spent time there, they hardly have any time off, but they do have some. They have some breaks, and they can take a very small amount of personal stuff with them. So they can take something like 2 books. And that they take their 2 books and they spend ages choosing their 2 books really, really carefully, and hope that they haven't got the same 2 books as someone else there, I expect. And that, but in fact, they never read their books, because any spare time they have, they spend staring out of the window, looking back at Earth. And it's well known for lots of astronauts have become very interested in in environmental protection, and feel very precious about protecting the Earth, but also just fascinated by that perspective they get when they draw right back. And I think you can do the same thing for yourself. There's a NASA the NASA satellite. You can watch the NASA satellite live online, and the space station goes around the Earth every hour and a half. So if you just have it on, sometimes I just have it on in the background on my computer, and you can just see the views. Sometimes it's dark, obviously, where you're looking, and then suddenly you see twinkling lights, and then you might see deserts. And there is something about getting that far away perspective on things. And there was a study that people might have heard about that came out just about a month and a half ago, by Virginia Sturm, a psychologist in the States, about oar walks. That's not oar as in a paddle, but oar, AWE. And these oar walks, they gave people were over the age of 60, and they had to go for 1 15-minute walk a week. One group just did that, and the other group went for 1 15-minute walk, and then were given some very simple instructions that while they were on their walk, they should look for things that made them feel awestruck. And they didn't have to be nature, but people often did pick things that were nature. They could be human made, so it could be an amazing building or something like that. And they had to look for the things that inspired in them a childlike wonder that they may have forgotten about. And they did this once a week as well. And at the end of the time, they looked at various measures of well-being and pro-social behavior, how pro-social thoughts, how sympathetic people felt towards other people. And they found that there were positive benefits of doing the oar walks. And the other thing they did was to get people to take selfies wherever they went. And they actually did this to get people to prove that they'd done it, so that they weren't mucking about. And they got them to take selfies, and they noticed, and she told me they were staggered by this, that over time, the people who went on the oar walks made themselves smaller in the selfie, and made the world around them bigger in the selfie, almost as if they really were changing their perspective on things and feeling that there was a bigger world out there. And I think that my hunch is that rather than the other explanations, that is what nature is doing for people. And what's amazing about the oar walks is once you start, you can't stop. I mean, now I just find myself doing it, just going to the shop to get some milk and looking at the trees. I mean, it's helped that obviously there's been lovely leaves on the trees to look at, but now I just keep spotting things and thinking, oh, I'll have that. That's an oar thing. And so it's sort of compulsive, actually. Quite fun.
Well, I think we've now arrived at the point in the talk where we finally reveal what was number one in the rest test. So as this comes from your new book, you're probably very pleased to reveal that number one in the list was actually reading.
I know, it's brilliant when you're going to write a book and you find that number one, reading is number one. Publishers are very pleased about that too. Now, we were surprised about this. So 58% of you could put down more than one activity, 3 activities in order, and 58% of people put down reading. And we were quite surprised by this because reading does involve some cognitive effort. You've got to make sense of the, see the letters and make them into words, make sense of the words, and then make meaning of what you're reading, put it into context with what you already know, perhaps with your own life, perhaps with what you were reading earlier, and do all of those sorts of things. But reading does seem to be relaxing. And it's really interesting when I looked around for studies on why reading might be relaxing. It was very hard to find studies that had specifically looked at this. But instead, what I did find was various studies on things like yoga and Tai Chi, where reading had been the control condition. And so almost by accident, researchers had found out how relaxing reading was. I felt quite sorry for them in a way because they're probably hoping to demonstrate how relaxing yoga and Tai Chi are. And then they chose as their control something that seemed to be just as relaxing. And so many of these studies found they were equal. So it's not that the yoga and the Tai Chi weren't relaxing. It was just that reading was as relaxing as well. Now, it doesn't seem to make a difference whether people are reading fiction or non-fiction. And I think that what is special about it is that, again, it allows people to escape from the thoughts and the worries. And I think this is such a crucial part of rest. They may feel it's easier to give themselves permission to do it because reading is generally, these days, obviously it wasn't always, seen as a good thing. There were times when, parents were supposed to stop their children reading novels. And in early Victorian times, they were not seen as a good thing at all. But it allows you to escape, to empathize and reflect on other people's lives. Even non-fiction books often have obviously stories of other people's lives, and to be alone, to not, as in not have the effort of being with the other people, but also to be in company in a way that they've got the company of the characters. And there have been some studies on loneliness in older people and how reading fiction can sometimes help to alleviate that. And there've been some really interesting studies on this. There was in the 1980s, Victor Nell did lots of studies on this in South Africa, and found lots of avid readers and did lots of bookworm studies. He advertised actually to say, do you read more than 4 books a week? He had a frustration index where he asked people how desperate they would be, how they would feel if they were stuck in a hotel room and didn't have a book. And people, the real bookworms, would say that they would feel desperate and desolate and dispossessed. And that's quite an entertaining study. But also, I think I like the studies on, I think the other thing that reading lets you do, actually, again, back to this, is daydream. And so there have been really interesting studies on what psychologists slightly judgmentally call mindless reading. And mindless reading is, we've all had the experience where you read all the way down the page and your eyes are moving and you get all the way to the bottom and then you realize you haven't taken any of it. So you go back and you read it all again and you still haven't taken any of it because you were thinking about something else. And you can tell, there's some really interesting studies. There's one by Franklin and et al., which is from 2011. Really interesting studies on mindless reading, where they use eye tracking devices to work out when people aren't concentrating. And they can do this because when you're not concentrating, your eyes do still go across the page and down and down and down, but they do it at a constant speed if you're not concentrating. Whereas if you are reading it, people slow down fractionally, which eye trackers can measure, if they come across a word that's unfamiliar, or if they come across a very long word. Even if they know it, a really long word, people will slightly slow down. So you can tell whether people are reading or not. And it does turn out that quite a lot of the time people are not concentrating on when they're on what they're reading. But I think that's fine. Even with my book, that's absolutely fine. I will allow that, because I think it's because it's a jumping off point for daydreaming again, which might be because it's about other people and you might then reflect on your own life and how that fits in with those other people, or you may think more about their lives as well, and that it sort of stays with you. You know, Virginia Woolf used to talk about the emotional effect of books staying with you for days, and said, you know, wait for the read something and then wait for the dust to settle. It will return, but differently. Which is so true. And we did wonder, and you may be wondering this, whether people only put reading because they were trying to look good, but we did notice, of course, you know, doing nothing came at number 5. So people were perfectly happy to say that they liked doing nothing. So I think we have to take that at face value, if you like, of being okay.
So a couple of people have asked this in the chat, and I thought I'd jump in now, which is, so was what they were reading in terms of non-fiction, fiction, anything like that taken into account, and also whether they're reading stuff on, one of these, or a Kindle, or an actual real book with pages and everything. Like, did that make any difference?
Yeah, so in the rest test, we didn't know what people were reading, but there have been other studies done which have found that non-fiction and fiction don't seem to make a difference in terms of relaxingness, if you like, but they do make a difference in terms of empathy. There's been really interesting work done on the increase in empathy that people who read a lot of fiction seem to get, and there's been increasing amounts on that. That you're reading something where it's really well described from very personal way, from another person's perspective. In terms of, I can't find any studies that have been done in terms of relaxation and reading when it comes to e-readers. And what we do know is that people can't, it's much harder to remember the name of the book you're reading if you're reading it on an e-reader, because you don't keep seeing the cover, because it's not left around. So I find people will often recommend me books and they'll say, it's really brilliant, I'm reading it on my Kindle, but I don't know what it's called. That's not very helpful.
I've had a similar thing with music, actually, because obviously with streaming services like Spotify, you don't have the album cover and the CD that you've bought that's that reminder. So something happens that I'll be listening to a record and be like, buy again.
But I think there is a real gap, actually, research-wise, because as I was saying, there are these sort of accidental studies where reading and relaxation are there. And I think it would be really interesting to know about the restfulness of reading, different sorts of things. And also some of the studies on whether people liked reading and how often people did it do count magazines and newspapers as well. It can be reading anything that is reading for pleasure, if you like.
So even Twitter?
Does Twitter count as reading for pleasure? That's very interesting to discuss. Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because then you could just say surfing the internet in general. And it's interesting that nothing to do with the internet came in the top 10, even when people could put anything at all down that they wanted to. So even though people are doing it, people may really enjoy it. It doesn't mean they necessarily find it relaxing. I think it would depend a lot. It'd be quite hard to do a study on Twitter because people aren't getting the same thing. So it depends a lot on who you're following. So if you follow lots of argumentative people you disagree with, then it may be less relaxing.
And I suppose that goes with all, social networks as well, like, Instagram or Facebook or whatever. It depends on what's going on your particular Facebook or your particular Instagram that might.
Now, obviously, Instagram tends to have beautiful pictures. Many people's feeds have more beautiful pictures. So I think many people would say they found Instagram more relaxing than Twitter, even though they might like both. So I do both, but the Instagram is more. It's lovely seeing people's beautiful pictures. There's one called, I tell you one that's really relaxing. Now, there hasn't been any research on this. I just find it really relaxing. It's called Adventures in Jelly. And it is every single day with really old Edwardian molds. They make a different jelly and then they wiggle it slightly and film it in the most amazing slow motion. And they're just stunning. They're so stunning and relaxing. I'd quite like to do a study on that.
Fantastic. Well, so if that's one tip on maybe being more, do you have any other evidence-based tips?
I've got some evidence-based ones. Yes, the jelly, to be fair, is not.
It's more a theory than
exactly. That's just my anecdote and data, not the plural anecdote. Yes. So, but in terms of the things that I think have come out from all this evidence. So I was saying, do the things you're not allowed to do ling staring out of the window and things like that. There's been some really interesting studies on one way of resting before bed. So resting in order that you can get to sleep faster, is some interesting research from the States on making to-do lists before you go to sleep. Now, that may seem sort of counterintuitive because you may think, the last thing I want to do before I go to sleep is think about all the things I've got to do tomorrow. But there seems to be, in a way, that it's offloading. If you make a to-do list, it could be on the phone or written down before you go to sleep, that it's offloading. That's all down on that piece of paper now, and that's what I'm going to do, and I haven't got to worry about it. I haven't got to worry about remembering it because it's on the list, but also that's for tomorrow, it's not for now, and seems to put it out of people's minds. And often people find trouble sleeping because of what's going around in their minds. The other thing I think people should do is to find the 2 or 3 activities you find the most restful. And of course, they will be, as we've seen from the research, they are different for different people, but to find the activities that you find the most restful and to work out how you can, for the sake of your mental health, so you needn't feel guilty, prescribe yourself 15 minutes of that really restful activity, say in the middle of the afternoon. So I have started doing this, and if I am working at home, then gardening is the thing I find really restful, and devastatingly it wasn't in the top 10, so I couldn't write about it. I'd have had to do lots more chapters to write about that. But what I do deliberately now, I admit I didn't today because it was pouring with rain, is to go out into the garden for 15 minutes in the middle of the afternoon and just, potter a bit and deadhead things and muck about and see what I'm growing. I've got a tiny greenhouse that just room for me to stand in and look and see what's happening there. And I find, for me, that is so restful that I can feel the waves of calmness coming over me, and then can come back and work again and feel so much better. And I used to, sometimes do that anyway, because I really like being in the garden, particularly if the weather's nice. But then I would feel guilty. Now I don't feel guilty at all. I just think, well, this is for the sake of my mental health. It's just 15 minutes. I'm going to do this. So I think it's well worth working out what are the things that are restful that you can build in to your day. If some people are so busy, and obviously people, particularly people who've got caring responsibilities as well as work, and people with very small children, it is very hard to find any time to rest at all. One thing I would say is to try to reframe any wasted time you can find as rest, and to notice when you're getting some rest. And so maybe if you've missed a parcel and you've got to go and queue at the delivery office, that's really annoying, and it's going to take you 10 minutes. And you may feel frustrated because you've got loads to do. But at another time, if somebody said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to grant you 10 minutes of rest now, where all you've got to do is stare at the world go by, then maybe you would like that. So I think you can reframe wasted time as well. I've got a bonus opportunity to rest now, and that's what I'm going to do. And maybe think about whether exerting the body to rest your mind is something that you find relaxing. It's good to experiment with doing that to see whether or not that works for you.
Fantastic. Well, Claudia, I've just been compiling all these questions in the chat. We've had so many brilliant questions. So I'm just going to launch straight into them. We'll try and get as many as we can done.
Okay, I'll try not to give too long answers so that you get more in.
So this question's come up from a few different people. Gavin, David, Ian have all asked a similar question. Gavin says, how do different cultures impact what is seen as rest? David says, which countries' regions is the busy equals high status most and least prevalent? And Ian asks, is there a nation whose population stands out as being masters of the art of rest? There's all lots of cultural in different countries. Just to answer Ian's last question, I've always found Canadians very, very chilled out. So maybe it's them, or maybe the Dutch.
It's interesting that Canada was the ones who had nature for top as their restfulness. So maybe they are onto something there. So what was interesting was, in terms of how many hours of rest people got, we didn't see enormous difference between. There were 9 countries where we had big enough samples to really look in detail at this, and we didn't see enormous amounts of difference. I mean, they were sort of things like 3 hours was the average amount of hours of rest, and that may sound like quite a lot, but remember, people could define what was restful. So if your train journey is restful for you, or cooking the dinner is restful for you, that would count. And so some countries were 3 hours was the average. Some would be more like 3 hours and 9 minutes, and others would be 2 hours and 57 minutes. But there were not really significant differences between countries in the amounts of rest that they said that they got. People who took part were the survey was not translated, so people were taking part in English. So that may have made some difference in some places to who spoke English. An anecdote, which is only an anecdote and not data, which was that when interestingly, the very first countries to buy translations of my book, who immediately got in touch with the publishers and said they were very interested in the topic of rest, were Japan and China and Taiwan, really fast, which was very interesting, I thought, and instructive. So there seemed to be an interest in the topic there, and that would make sense with what we know about some of the ancient traditions that are involving practices, meditation practices and so on, and things that people might consider restful. There was one bit what was the very first one of those questions you asked?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
in it that I've
So how do different cultures impact what is seen as rest? So
what's seen as rest? Yes.
Is something restful in
Yes.
Japan
So
that's
that,
actually
yeah.
stressful in England?
Yes, so I don't know if other studies that have looked for that, because there have been so few studies done on rest that I don't know other studies that have looked at that. But in ours, that main difference was that India and Canada having nature first and Germany being alone first. But other than that, I thought the top 10 were remarkably similar. So it wasn't that socializing or gardening suddenly, supposedly, Britain, everyone loves gardening allegedly, but gardening didn't suddenly shoot up high in those, which I thought the uniformity about it was quite interesting, actually.
Yeah, and just then the other question was about that kind of being busy is equal to having a high status.
Yes.
Now, is that kind of now, obviously with Western business practices
Yeah.
sort of worldwide, is that kind of now sort of standard, or is being a sort of emperor sitting on a gilded cushion or something valued more in other cultures?
Really interesting. I don't know of studies that have compared lots of cultures on their attitudes towards busyness, because so much of this is new. But I was mentioning earlier the study with the fictional Sally Fisher that Silvia Bellessa did. Silvia Bellessa also did a study comparing people in Italy with people in America, and this one had an Italian called, he was called Giovanni for the Italians and Jeff for the Americans. And again, they gave him a sort of fictional picture of this person, not Facebook updates this time, just a description. And in one of the Giovanni's, Jeffs, they were told about, spent not that much time working and quite a lot of time seeing friends and doing other nice things and interesting things. And the other one, again, there was a busy version of Jeff Giovanni who spent most of their time working and didn't have much time off. And then they asked them how successful they thought they were. And in Italy, more often people said that they thought the man who didn't work very much was successful. And in America, people thought the man who worked a lot was successful. So in Italy, the reasoning went more that he's so successful, he doesn't have to work much anymore. Whereas the Americans thought the successful people work more. And that's the most interesting cross-cultural study I know on busyness, on this status idea. So I think if you did a study around lots of countries, you would find differences.
Yeah, fascinating. And actually, while we're on the world of work, there's been a couple of questions about that, actually. So Neville asked a really interesting question about how many employers have shared with their managers, supervisors, and team leaders that their employees need maybe permitted a few seconds of eyes closed rest every half hour. And somebody else, I can't remember where that went, was saying, yeah, so what would that mean, therefore, we should maybe shorten the working week and build in? So it's kind of working more than 40 hours a week is going to be, obviously you're going to get less and less productive the more and more hours you work, and so therefore should we be thinking about limiting working weeks to 35 hours and building in sort of mandatory rest breaks in there?
Yeah, it's really interesting this, and there's been this whole debate about the 4-day week, and whether the 4-day week would be helpful so that everybody could have 3 days doing other stuff instead. And I think it's really interesting, the 4-day week idea. But I think what might be the issue is, and obviously what people like about that idea is that in theory you get paid the same for your 4 days. But if your workload is going to stay the same, then what's going to be sacrificed is the breaks on those days, I think. So there might be swings and roundabouts with that. So you may have your nice 3 days relaxing, but your 4 days work might be really, really hard. And then you might miss the natural breaks that the breaks you would like to take during the day, which can also be, interesting and sociable. And that we know we're missing out on the socializing now at work, and know how important that can be. And so if you had 4 really, really hard days, and then you may spend your 5th day just recuperating from having the hard day, and then spend your weekend dreading it again. So I think they have to be looked at really carefully. People do 4-day weeks do seem to be really popular if the workload is managed. And I think that's the difficulty. And I think that can be the difficulty if sometimes employers will say, oh, you don't need to, nobody should be working more than their 40 hours or their 37 hours. And we really don't want people to have to work more than that. But if you're giving them too much work, then that can just be even more annoying for employees, I think, to be told that they're somehow being wrong for working too long if that's the workload that they've been given. But I think it's really difficult because I think workloads in so many places are going up. And also I think that there are so many places now where, if you think of, say, some call centers or delivery, depots, where people's breaks are very, very regimented. And people's loo breaks are timed and so on. And I think that's a real shame that we've got to a stage where that's happening.
Yeah, and someone actually mentioned that. I've lost the name actually. That said, I can get stressed if you order me to rest now. Rest means to me the ability
Yes,
to get bored or daydream, but sort of, if it's
yes,
11 o'clock, it's the enforced company stare at the wall for a minute. You know,
yes, yes,
I don't know if
yes.
that would
So I
be
think
restful.
yes, no, enforced rest absolutely isn't, and that's like back to the people in prison or the people who are
Mm.
furloughed. If it was enforced, it's not necessarily fun in the same way, and so it doesn't necessarily work, and it's yeah. So autonomy at work is so important. If there's ways for people to be given autonomy at work, it makes such a difference.
John mentioned an interesting point where he said, I find target shooting to be restful, especially
Ooh,
when I can get into the zone. And that bit about getting into the zone, I think it's called a flow state, isn't it? That's the sort of
yes,
psychological
yeah,
term. Was
yeah,
that kind of looked at? Because for me, a flow state is subtly different from just kind of doing an activity, or I don't know, it sort of means
yeah,
like you're sort of in the zone, you're flowing, you're doing the thing.
yeah,
It was that kind of, I mean, obviously this was a self-reported thing, so people might not self-report being in a flow state as being
yeah.
a restful thing, but
But
was
yeah,
that kind of looked at in
this
other
was
research?
yeah, flow is really interesting, and it was a concept that was developed by the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, and flow is when you feel so absorbed by something that it's not exactly that the time goes fast or the time goes slowly. You're almost out of time and you just sort of don't notice the time passing. And people may get that from it's often creative things, but not always. So it may be something where you really have to concentrate. It would make a lot of sense with the target shooting. Again, that stops you thinking about those thoughts whirring around in your minds and the stresses. And I can see why that would then be relaxing. Many people, it might be something like painting. They can just get really, really into it. Or I do find that gardening, I mean, I can just do it for hours and hours and be really, really just calm and happy in that state and stop worrying about other things. And so I think there is quite a lot in common with flow, actually. But I think that an activity doesn't have to give you get you into a flow state in order to be relaxing. But I think what they have in common is this stopping other thoughts going. And it's so important, this things that distract you from those thoughts so that you're not thinking about them all the time.
That's really interesting. So slightly more silly questions coming up, I'm afraid. Ben asks, was smoking considered a restful activity in the rest test? And I'll probably add, it depends if you're smoking a stimulant or a depressant, really. Or...
Yeah, smoking didn't come up. I don't remember smoking coming up. I mean, it may have done in the free box where you could say anything at all. Then lots of nice things like listening to the radio came up there, which I liked. But no, it didn't. And interestingly, drinking was at number 20. Yeah, number 20 was drinking socially. And, we know it is not uncommon for people to relax, find a glass of wine relaxing. So it was interesting that didn't come up high, in fact, as what people found restful.
Really interesting. So Scarlett asked an interesting question, which was, could procrastination be a result of our tendency not to get enough rest? So the reason we're putting off starting that job is because actually our brain's still kind of whirring and we haven't sort of rested. Is there? I know there's some interesting research out on there on procrastination.
Yeah, there is actually. Yeah, procrastination research is really interesting, and sometimes it is that you are afraid of the thing you are procrastinating about, that you are worried that you will fail at a project. And sometimes they have found that people who score high on scales of perfectionism might tend to procrastinate more because they're afraid to get started in case they fail and don't do it as perfectly as they'd like to. But that is not always the case every time. And I think sometimes people procrastinate because they sometimes find that it's hard to focus, and it is harder to focus if people are feeling tired and weary. And so it's interesting because you could be resting while you procrastinate. You could procrastinate by keep having breaks. And interestingly, when I was talking to the A-level students this morning, they were very keen on the idea of resting a lot. And I was telling them how they're not to go home and say to their parents that this woman today told us we must rest all the time, because that's not what I'm saying. It is all about the rhythm of those activities. So I think it may be that may be one where you do want to save the reward of your rest until you've done some, so that you've got started. And once people have got started, then procrastination becomes less of a problem.
Fascinating. So just to repeat, I think somebody asked a question earlier about The sort of the top 10. So we had the top 5, but your book is 10, I think, isn't it?
Yes,
So
it is.
I don't know if you want to give people the countdown and just comment on some of the ones you haven't said before.
Yeah, so mindfulness was number 10. Oh, it's mindfulness or any type of meditation was number 10. Watching TV, which I did mention, was number 9. That did count as anything to do with watching screens, watching, moving pictures on your screen. Daydreaming was number 8. Having a hot bath was number 7. Going for a walk was number 6. So 38% of people put down going for a walk. And interestingly, 16% exercise generally and 8% running. Doing nothing was 40%. Listening to music was just under that. Being was 41%, just over that. Being on your own, being in nature, and then reading was the top one. And interestingly, like spending time with your pets, animals, which I thought would be really high, was at number 12, so didn't make it into the top 10. Sex was at number 22.
Somebody asked that in the comments. I'm glad that came
did
up.
they? Yeah, well, interestingly, younger people under the age of 30, people were more like daydreaming, sex, and what's the other one? Having a hot bath came out higher if people were under 30 than if they weren't. With the sex, I don't know if that means they're doing it the right way or the wrong way, but they found it more restful.
Oh, well, there you go. So Adrian says, therefore, walking alone in nature with music in his ears and daydreaming at the same time. Is there any way you can multiply the effects of the different forms of rest?
That's such a good idea. I wonder if you found the ones. Depends if you suddenly had so many different stimuli that you then started to not feel very restful after all. But that actually does sound really nice, because then when you get back, you could have a hot bath and then watch some TV. Read a book in the bath, then watch some TV, and then you just need to get in then sit and do nothing, and then you just need to get the mindfulness in as well.
So, but then Tom, I think you mentioned this right at the start, but for those who didn't catch it, Tom asked, is there a tipping point when more rest stops having benefits? And I think you sort of said that 10 hours,
yes,
10 hours of rest a day.
Yes, so more than 5 to 6 hours of rest a day was less rest, was where people's well-being then started to go down again. Yes, it is absolutely about the rhythms of rest and activity. It's not just a question of the more rest, the better, because obviously in the end, rest can tip over into boredom. Like I was saying, people in prison will not say they feel rested; they're bored.
So there's a couple of, I'd say, more challenging questions that I sort of save till the end, just to keep you on your toes. So David asks, how reliable are people's self-reports? Of course, the rest test was all self-reports, and you sort of talked about this. Yeah. But how do, these are just sort of what people said were the most restful things. Yes. But is there any way that we've done sort of neuroscience studies to prove that this is what people self-report is the correct thing? How do people know how they really like to rest?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Are people wrong about it? Inevitably it's subjective, so are people wrong about what they say? So there are some studies like the ones I was saying about, say for example, comparing reading with yoga, which do look at things like people's heart rate and blood pressure and galvanic skin response and so on. In response to those, it would be lovely if there were a study which compared all of these 10 to see what difference it made to people. There are studies on each of them about whether what impact they say might have on the body. I mean, there's lots and lots of studies on listening to music, for example, and looking at the sorts of music people choose when they are stressed or not stressed, and looking at where personal taste comes into that and how that works. But they're very much more individual studies of these different activities rather than or comparing all at once. So what would be really nice is to follow a group of people while they did each of these activities, and to then look to see how accurate their self-reports were. Would be really interesting.
Yeah, and just you were talking right at the start. You were talking about people taking more rest, scoring highly on well-being. Matthew made an interesting point. Maybe you could flip it, and actually the ones that have the self-confidence to make the time and allow themselves to rest are therefore the ones with the higher well-being, and therefore so it's the well-being causing the rest rather than the rest causing the well-being.
Oh, absolutely, it could be this. So it was absolutely cross-sectional, and so we don't know which came first, so you'd need to do a piece of longitudinal research to do that. But yeah, it could be, and that's partly what is so interesting, I think, with our relationship with rest. Is it the case that if you're already happier, you find it easier to rest, possibly?
That's a very interesting point to end on. Just before I let you promote your book once more, it's just time for me to say a few things before we end. Firstly, as I said at the start, anyone is welcome to join the Royal Institution as a member or a patron. There's no qualification, there's no nomination. You just have to like what we do and want to support our work. If you've enjoyed the stream, please donate £10 to our little Just Giving link that has been popping up throughout the talk. Definitely buy the book. The Art of Rest is available in all good bookshops now, probably all over the world. As you're saying, it's being translated into Japanese and Chinese and
lots and lots of languages.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So
and it has good names in other languages as well. So the one in Dutch came out last week, and it's called Rust, which I quite liked.
Well, is that the Dutch for rest, or is it? Oh,
yes. Well, I assume it is, or they've got completely the wrong idea about what it's about. But yes, I assume it is. But it's just called Rust across the front. I just thought that was quite funny.
I thought it might have been one of those things where, like, how James Bond is Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang in China, like it's been translated into some kind of other completely different thing.
Yeah.
Never mind. So yeah, please do go out and grab your copy of The Art of Rest. Claudia, where can people find you on the internet if they want to find out more about your book or anything else about your work?
They can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Claudia Hammond, and they can find my website is claudiahammond.com, and then All in the Mind is my Radio 4 program, Health Check is my World Service program, but all of those there are links on my website. There are links to all of those. And can I just say, what brilliant question? I'm just looking at all the other questions. People ask such good questions at this event.
I know this has been fantastic.
One.
There's been so many brilliant questions. I haven't been able to get to all of them. So thank you so much for joining us and sending in all of your thoughts and comments. It makes my job really easy and quite entertaining as well. So thank you so much for all of your contributions. Do check out claudiahammond.com. Do check out rigp.org. But in the meantime, I'm now going to go off and stare at the wall for 15 minutes. So thanks very much, Claudia. It's been an absolutely fascinating evening, and take care, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.